The camel coat hanging by the door of the Connecticut farmhouse has a faint ink stain inside the left breast pocket, a small blue smudge from a fountain pen that leaked sometime in the early 90s, and the woman who owns it has never once considered replacing it. The wool is heavy and faintly waxy under the fingers, the kind they don't really weave anymore, dense enough to turn a cold wind, and soft enough to have molded over the years to the exact set of her shoulders. The buttons are real horn, chipped at the edges from decades of being fastened with cold hands in the gravel driveway, and one of them is fractionally lighter than the rest, replaced after the original cracked clean through on a ski trip she could still name. When she pulls it on to walk the dogs at dusk, she looks to anyone who happens to pass on the lane like money. Not new money, not loud money. The quiet, settled kind that never raises its voice and never needs to. And here is the part that should stop you cold. That coat is older than most of the people who turn to admire it. There is a myth that wealth at this level means a closet that turns over constantly, a revolving door of seasonal arrivals and last year's regrets quietly bundled off to consignment. The truth runs almost exactly the opposite direction, and it runs there on purpose. The genuinely old-moneyed often wear the same small handful of garments for 20, 30, sometimes 40 years, and they do it with a conviction that looks from the outside almost like stubbornness. It is not stubbornness, and it is certainly not frugality. These are people who could refurnish the whole wardrobe before lunch without glancing at a single price. They are doing something far more deliberate than saving money, something that touches on who they believe themselves to be, and once you understand what it is, you will start seeing it everywhere. At the airport, at the wedding, in the row ahead of you at the symphony, on the shoulders of the man who didn't dress to be looked at and is therefore impossible to stop looking at. If you enjoy these quiet breakdowns of how the old money world actually works, take a second to subscribe. It's the simplest way to make sure the next one finds you. To understand why they hold on so tightly, you have to begin with the coat, because the coat is where the entire philosophy first shows its hand. A man I'll call Edward, the type who summers in a house his grandfather built, and would sooner chew glass than mention it, owns a single navy overcoat from a tailor on Savile Row that has now outlived 2 cars, 1 marriage, and a much-mourned Labrador. It has been relined twice. The collar was rebuilt by hand after the original frayed past saving, and the tailor who did the work was the son of the man who'd cut it in the first place. Edward could buy a new overcoat this afternoon without the faintest twinge, and that is precisely the reason he never will. To him, replacing it would amount to a small confession, an admission that the first choice had been disposable all along, that he hadn't truly known his own taste the day he commissioned it. Old money treats the wardrobe the way it treats the house and the surname, as something inherited and maintained, never something merely consumed. The coat, in other words, is not a purchase at all. It's a position. And the very next piece they refuse to surrender makes that position impossible to miss. There is almost nothing that exposes a person faster at this level than what sits at the bottom of the outfit. And the people we are talking about wear leather that has been resoled so many times the cobbler greets them by their first name and knows the precise shape of their arch without measuring. Picture a pair of dark brown bench-made brogues bought in a hushed little shop off German Street. The autumn someone went up to university and now worn so far into their life that the leather has darkened and deepened in a way no factory finish can imitate. They are polished by hand on a Sunday evening, the cloth working small circles while something plays on the radio. They are fitted with cedar shoe trees overnight to draw the damp out and hold the shape. They are rotated religiously so that no single pair is ever worn 2 days running, because the man who owns them learned long ago that a day of rest is what lets good shoes last a lifetime. A stranger glancing down sees shoes that look expensive, and they are not wrong. But what they are actually looking at is something money cannot purchase in a single weekend, no matter how much of it you have. The patina of an object cared for faithfully across decades. New shoes shout their newness. These ones murmur. And the murmur, it turns out, is the whole point, which brings us to the single object the women in this world tend to guard most fiercely of all. The handbag. Not the one that arrives in a dust bag with a waiting list and a price that makes the evening news. The other kind entirely. A structured leather bag, often in a muted tan or a deep oxblood, with brass hardware gone soft and honeyed from handling and corners rubbed pale from being set down on 1,000 marble countertops and restaurant banquettes. At a Hamptons gala last summer, a younger woman in head-to-toe current season, everything spent the cocktail hour quietly clocking the room, ranking it, slotting each guest into a hierarchy she was building in real time. And her gaze kept snagging on an older woman in an unremarkable navy dress, holding a bag she could not identify. That was the source of the discomfort. The bag wasn't from this year or the last 10 years, and so it couldn't be priced, couldn't be placed, couldn't be ranked at all. It carried no logo doing the talking, No silhouette she could date to a collection. Nothing whatsoever to feed the machinery of comparison. The older woman had carried that bag since her 30s. It had been to christenings and funerals and across 3 continents, and it would comfortably outlast the gala, the navy dress, and, in all likelihood, the younger woman's interest in any of it. The bag won simply by refusing to play the game. And the reason it could refuse is tied to a single unspoken rule that almost no one in that room could have put into words. Here is the rule, stated plainly. The pieces that survive 30 years are, without a single exception, the pieces that have nothing left to prove. No season stamped into them, no slogan, no clever detail engineered to be recognized from across a crowded room. A cream silk blouse that skims rather than clings. A pair of gray flannel trousers with a break that was correct in 1985 and is correct now. The camel coat. A single strand of pearls that belonged to a grandmother and is quietly understood to belong one day to a granddaughter. These objects are deliberately illegible to the status-anxious eye, and that illegibility is the entire flex. Because the moment you no longer require your clothing to announce your position, you have revealed the one thing that can't be bought outright. That your position was never for a second in question. The Milanese understand this in their bones, perhaps better than anyone alive, which is exactly where the next scene takes us. To a dinner where the most powerful person at the table was, on paper, by a wide margin, the most underdressed. It was a private dining room off a quiet courtyard in Milan, the kind of place with no sign above the door, and a lock that only turns if they are expecting you. Around the table sat a careful collection of beautiful people in beautiful, expensive, considered clothing. Every fold deliberate, every label chosen to be half-glimpsed and understood. And at the head of it all sat an elderly man in a soft gray cashmere sweater that had pilled very slightly at one elbow, with a watch on a worn leather strap he had so plainly stopped thinking about years ago. Everyone else at that table had dressed for the room. He had dressed for himself, decades earlier, and had simply never seen a reason to stop. The newcomers spent the first 20 minutes of dinner trying to work out who on earth he was, because nothing he wore offered them a single foothold. And that complete absence of information turned out to be the most magnetic thing in the room. The cashmere told you nothing, so you found yourself leaning in to learn everything. This is the quiet engine, humming underneath the entire philosophy, and it runs in the precise opposite direction of nearly everything most of us were ever taught about how to be seen. Most of us are trained, from the very first job interview onward, to dress in order to be read, to broadcast signals, to telegraph competence and taste and ambition and seriousness through the things we drape on our bodies. We learn to dress as an argument we are making to the room. The old money instinct inverts that completely and without apology. They dress to withhold. They hand the room less rather than more, and in doing so they quietly force everyone else to do the exhausting work of wondering. The pilled cashmere, the dulled brass clasp, the resoled brogue, the bag that can't be dated. Every one of them is a small, calm act of refusal, a decision not to enter the endless churn of proving and reproving one's worth season after season. They have stepped off the treadmill entirely while everyone around them keeps running. And there is one particular garment that demonstrates this refusal more purely than any of the others, a piece almost everyone overlooks precisely because it spends most of its life slung casually over the back of a chair. The blazer, specifically the navy blazer in a hardy wool hopsack, gold or horn buttons catching the light, cut a touch fuller through the chest than anything you could buy off a rail today. Because it was bought before today, in a decade when clothes were built to be grown old inside, rather than discarded the moment the shoulders dated. In a London drawing room, on a gray Saturday afternoon with the rain doing its patient work against the tall windows, you will find one tossed over the arm of a sofa as though it cost nothing at all, when in truth it has been the single most worn possession its owner has carried for the better part of 30 years. He wears it to the races and to lunch and to the theater and to drinks that quietly turn into dinner. The lining has been replaced once. One button is a near match rather than a perfect one, swapped after the original rolled under a hotel bed in Vienna and was never seen again. And he can tell you the exact trip, the exact city, very nearly the exact evening. That blazer holds more of his actual life than his passport does. And that, in the end, is what the 30-year wardrobe is truly about. Not thrift, not even taste in the ordinary sense, but memory. Every one of these objects is a vessel, and the people who own them understand something about belongings that the rest of the consuming world has been very carefully, very profitably trained to forget. They understand that a thing you keep long enough quietly becomes a thing that means something. The coat with the ink stain is not kept in spite of the stain. On some level it is kept because of it. Because that small blue smudge is a date, a desk, a letter that was written and sent and changed something. When you replace a garment every single season, you never allow it to gather any of that weight. You stay perfectly fluent in this year's language and completely illiterate in your own history. The old money closet is, in the truest sense, a kind of autobiography written in wool and leather, and the soft gleam of worn brass and the steady refusal to replace anything is really a refusal to erase the chapters already written there. The pearls were worn to a wedding and then a funeral the same year. The Brogues walked a daughter down an aisle. Nothing in that closet is anonymous, which is exactly why the seventh and final piece is the one that tends to quietly undo people the moment they finally notice it. Because it isn't expensive at all, and it never was. It is a scarf gone thin and supple with washing, or a watch on its third leather strap, or a signet ring worn so smooth across the years that the family crest has all but melted away. Some small inherited thing of almost no market value whatsoever, the kind of object its owner would turn around and run back into a burning house to save. At a wedding in the English countryside last year, a young bride in an exquisite gown that surely cost more than the marquee it was photographed under stood beside her great-aunt, who wore a plain gold bangle that had been on her wrist since long before the bride was born. The bangle was thin, very slightly bent, and worth, at any jeweler's counter in the country, almost nothing at all. It was also, unmistakably to anyone who understood what they were looking at, the single most valuable object in the entire photograph. Because it was the only one in the frame that could not be bought. That is the secret hiding quietly underneath all 7 of these pieces. The coat, the shoes, the bag, the pearls, the cashmere sweater, the navy blazer, and the small inherited thing worn smooth by other hands. Not one of them is about price. Every single one of them is about time, and about the increasingly rare willingness to let an object stay long enough to carry it. And here's where the whole puzzle finally clicks into place, because none of it, not a thread of it, actually works if the person wearing it fidgets. The 30-year coat means precisely nothing on someone who keeps glancing around to check whether it's being noticed, who adjusts the collar one too many times, who wears the heirloom as an announcement rather than a habit. The entire effect, the ease, the illegibility, the strange gravity that makes a crowded room lean quietly inward, does not live in the clothes at all. It lives in the body. It lives in how a person carries a thing without sparing it a single conscious thought, in the stillness of the hands, in the unhurried way of crossing a room, in the complete absence of the small anxious movements that give everyone else away. That settled, unbothered physical presence is the harder half of the entire equation, and it is the half no amount of money can shortcut. If you have ever wanted to understand exactly how that presence is built, piece by piece, the presence protocol breaks down the specific cues, the stillness, the economy of movement, the way of occupying a space as though you have every right to it, that let understated clothes do their quiet, devastating work. It is the closest thing I've found to an actual map of the part almost no one ever bothers to explain. Because the coat, when you follow it all the way down, was never really about the coat at all. The woman standing in that Connecticut driveway at dusk, pulling the camel wool around her shoulders with the ink stain hidden against her heart, and the dogs already pulling at the lead, is not holding onto a garment. She is holding onto the version of herself who first slipped it on, and the version who wore it through every winter since, and the one still waiting somewhere up ahead in a future she has every intention of reaching wearing exactly this. And the strangest part, the part that takes people years to understand, is that the coat already knows something she has only just begun to.